He didn't rush. His hands moved over me like he'd waited a lifetime just to trace what was already his. And when he came inside me, slow, deep, wordless, I understood. This wasn't duty. This was choice. A night with no promises. And yet, I wanted to stay forever. If something in these first few lines stirred your curiosity, or simply made you pause, go ahead and like this video and subscribe to the channel. Because some stories begin quietly and end where you least expect. Barely remember the ceremony, only the scent. The air inside the stone chapel was thick with candle wax, old wood, and something faintly sweet. Cinnamon, I think. My mother used to simmer cinnamon sticks in tea every winter. That warmth had nothing to do with today. The chapel was silent except for the priest's voice and the crackle of a draft slipping through stained glass windows. I stood in white lace. I had stitched myself, hands trembling under the weight of cold metal cuffs disguised as wedding rings. Dominic, Velasco didn't smile. He stood tall, still, in a black suit that fit like armor. His eyes, sharp and distant, never once settled on me. When the priest asked if he would take me as his lawfully wedded wife, he simply nodded. No hesitation, but no warmth either. I was a solution, an agreement, a name on a line, and I said yes, because I had to, not because I loved him. I didn't. I hardly knew the man, but I knew what he held over us. My father's debt. Over $600,000 in defaulted loans. The kind that destroyed not only reputations but families. My mother's medication, the house we still lived in, my little brother's school tuition. They all stood on the edge of a cliff, and Dominic was the man holding the railing. Marry her, he'd told my father 2 months ago, his voice like cold steel over polished mahogany. Or lose everything. And now, I stood in a chapel as Elena Grace Velasco, wife of a man who hadn't spoken 10 full sentences to me. When it was over, no one clapped. No bouquet was thrown. No photos taken. The staff began blowing out candles before we had even left. The altar. I walked down the aisle alone. There's something people don't tell you about marrying out of necessity. It doesn't just bind your future. It redefines your past. That night, in the bridal suite, cold and immaculate with its velvet chairs and antique fireplace, I sat on the edge of the bed in silence. The dress clung to my skin, the pins digging into my scalp. I didn't cry. I didn't feel much of anything, until I saw the letter. It was tucked inside the drawer of the dressing table, hidden beneath a folded linen napkin. Yellowed at the corners, tied with a red silk ribbon I instantly recognized. My mother's. She always kept it in her sewing box to mark the special threads. She used that same ribbon the night she taught me to stitch French seams. My hands shook as I unfolded the paper. Her handwriting, curled, careful, rose from the page like a whisper across time. If you are reading this, my sweet girl, it means you've done something I never wanted for you, but perhaps something I always knew might happen. If the man you married is Dominic Velasco, then I need you to listen carefully. He is not what he appears, not only cold, not only powerful. I once knew a boy behind those eyes. He tried to hide his pain by controlling everything, including love. Don't hate him too quickly, and don't let your heart grow silent, even if his seems made of stone. Mom. I sat there for a long time, letter in my lap, the scent of cinnamon still lingering in the air like memory. I wanted to ask her what she meant, how she knew him, why she'd never told me. But she wasn't here to answer. She was in a care facility, tucked beneath white sheets, her mind drifting further away each month. Alzheimer's. That's what the doctors called it. I called it a slow goodbye. Maybe that's why I agreed to this marriage, because part of me thought I was already losing. So much I couldn't bear to lose her dignity too. Marrying Dominic wasn't noble. It was desperate. Quiet. Heavy. And yet, reading her letter, something shifted. Not softened exactly, but cracked. just enough to let in the possibility that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of my story. Or hers. Or his. I looked up, at the mirror. My reflection stared back with unfamiliar eyes, tired, afraid, but still mine. I set the letter aside, rose and walked to the window. Outside, snow had begun to fall. It touched the stone pathways like forgiveness. Somewhere in the vast mansion, Dominic Valesco was probably drinking his scotch in solitude, the way men like him always did in novels. Brooding, dark-eyed, haunted by choices. But this wasn't a novel. This was my life, and I had just stepped into the first chapter of it. Not as his wife by love, but maybe, just maybe, someone who could learn what it meant to be more than a bride bought with debt. Maybe I could be the woman who made him remember what it felt like to be real. The first morning I woke up as Elena Valesco. It was snowing, so hard the world looked erased. From the tall windows of my new bedroom, I could see only endless white and the outline of the pine trees in the valley below. The walls around me were soft gray, paneled in walnut, with built-in bookshelves and long velvet curtains that swallowed sound. It was a beautiful room, one you might imagine for a young duchess in a European winter tale. But it was cold, in the way things become cold when they're untouched. The bed was too wide for one person, but I had slept in it alone. There was no knock, no good morning, no tray of breakfast or sound of footsteps in the hallway. Dominic had not come to the room, and I hadn't expected him to. There had been no mention of a wedding night, and I was grateful for that. Grateful and oddly, a little hollow. I got up, wrapped myself in a robe too elegant to feel like mine, and wandered the halls of the Valesco estate like a guest in a silent museum. Each room had its own scent: cedarwood, old books, lemon oil. I passed portraits of men with proud jaws and silver hair, women with high cheekbones and corseted dresses. No smiles in any of them. Just the same cool, restrained elegance that Dominic wore like a second skin. In the dining room, I found a pot of coffee already made and a single cup set beside a folded newspaper. His routines were precise, quiet, controlled, like him. I took my cup and walked to the back of the house, where a small staircase led to the kitchen. This was the only room that felt like home. The ceilings were low, the tiles old and mismatched, the windows fogged from heat inside. And on the shelf near the spice rack, I found what I hadn't even realized I'd been looking for: a tin of cinnamon sticks. I don't know why, but I started boiling water. That became my ritual. Morning tea with cinnamon. I never saw Dominic during the day. He disappeared into the West Wing, his study, his office. Wherever it was, he ruled his world of real estate deals and silent ledgers. At night, I read my mother's letter again. Sometimes twice. I kept it in my bedside drawer, under the book I never finished. One evening, about 2 weeks after the wedding, a knock finally came. Not at my door, but at the back door of the house, the one near the greenhouse. I followed the sound and opened it to find a courier, bundled in navy and red, holding a clipboard and 2 white boxes. "Delivery for Mrs. Valesco," he said, smiling. Mrs. Valesco. That name still sat on me like borrowed clothing. I signed. Inside were medical invoices. My heart dropped as I flipped through them. Pages of hospital summaries, pharmacy charges, long-term care costs for my mother's facility. Dozens of line items. Thousands upon thousands of dollars. Then I saw the stamps in the corner. Paid in full, and not just recently. These bills had been paid 6 months ago. Before the wedding. Before the proposal. Before the debt was even mentioned. Dominic had been paying for my mother's care behind the scenes all this time, without telling me, without asking for anything. I sat at the kitchen table, the invoices, spread out like puzzle pieces, and stared into my cup of tea, now gone cold. What kind of man does that? I had thought he married me to protect himself, to settle a debt, to seal a transaction. But this wasn't obligation. It was something else. Not love, perhaps, but not calculation either. He had done it quietly. No recognition. No thanks. Expected. I thought of the line in my mother's letter. Don't hate him too quickly. That night, for the first time, I looked for him. I found him in the library, the fire glowing low. He sat in an armchair by the window, book closed in, his lap, not reading, just thinking. He looked up when I entered, eyes registering surprise, but not annoyance. I received some paperwork today, I said, my voice soft but steady. From St. Augustine's care home. He didn't move. He didn't explain. You paid for her, I continued. All of it. Even before you knew I'd say yes. He leaned forward, elbows on knees. She once saved me, he said simply. Years ago, when I didn't think I deserved saving. I waited, but that was all he offered. I didn't know, I whispered. Why didn't you tell me? Dominic shook his head, his gaze turning back to the fire. Not everything needs to be said to be true. There was nothing else between us in that moment. No grand gesture, no confessions. Just the silence of two people sitting in the same room, breathing the same air. No longer strangers, but not yet something else. I left him there, the light of the fire flickering against his cheekbones. He didn't follow, but he didn't need to. Something had already followed me back upstairs. Something quiet, warm, and slow. A seed, maybe, of understanding. Or something that might one day grow into love. My mother passed on a Sunday morning. The nurse called just before dawn, her voice careful but calm. She slipped away in her sleep. Peacefully. I sat at the edge of the kitchen chair, holding the receiver like it might slip through my fingers. Dominic was already awake. He stood across the room, a black mug in his hand, steam rising like a silent witness. I need to go, I said quietly. He nodded. No questions. Just a coat already in his hand, and the car warming up before I even found my shoes. We drove in silence, the highway still dark, headlights slicing through the Oregon fog like memory through grief. I didn't cry in the car. I stared out the window, watching trees blur into each other, my reflection faint in the glass. I thought about her hands, always in motion, always busy with thread or a spoon or my hair. I remembered how she hummed when she worked, not a song but something softer, like comfort made into sound. The hospice room was still warm when I arrived. She looked like she was sleeping. Her hands were folded on her chest, and someone had tucked a cinnamon stick under her pillow. I broke then, quietly, completely. Dominic waited in the hallway. I didn't ask him to come in, and he didn't try. But when I stepped out half an hour later, my legs shaking, my eyes sore, he simply opened his coat and let me lean into his chest. Not a word, just warmth and stillness. The funeral was small. A few old friends from town, the hospice nurse, my brother Peter, who flew in from New Jersey and stood next to me like a shadow half my height taller. My father was late. He showed, up at the burial, eyes bloodshot, collar twisted, and reeking of whiskey. He didn't say her name, just stood at the edge of the grave and muttered a prayer I think he made up on the spot. He never looked at me. Later that night, after the guests had gone and Peter had gone to bed, I found my father in the study. It wasn't his house anymore. It hadn't been for months. But grief made him bold, or reckless. You think I don't know what I did? He spat, slumped in the chair like a man unraveling. You think I don't wake up every morning knowing it's my fault your mother died worrying about us? Worrying about you? I didn't answer. I stood in the doorway, unsure whether to walk away or walk in. He laughed bitterly. You married? Him to save my skin. You sold yourself, Elena, and you think that makes me the monster? I didn't sell myself, I said. more tired than angry. I made a choice. You just gave me the reason. He looked at me then. Really looked. Then he muttered, "He didn't do it for me. That man, Dominic, he did it for your mother." My breath caught. What? She wrote him once. A long time ago. After his wife died. She helped him. I don't know how. I never asked. But he owed her. That's what he said when he came to see me about the debt. This is the last thing I can do for her. His voice dropped to a hoarse whisper. I thought he meant money. Turns out, he meant you. That night, Dominic came home late. I waited for him in the library, by the same fire that had warmed our first conversation. This time, I didn't wait for him to speak. She helped you, I said. My mother, didn't she? He stood at the threshold. The fire flickered across his face, casting lines I hadn't noticed before. Fatigue, yes, but also something quieter. Regret. She saved me, he said. He came forward slowly, then sat across from me. It was a long time ago. After my wife died, I stopped eating, stopped talking. I sat in that chair. He nodded toward the velvet armchair near the fireplace. For weeks. Your mother had been hired to tailor the drapes for the dining room. She showed up with pins, in her sleeve and cinnamon tea in her thermos. My eyes widened. She didn't ask me to speak. She just worked and hummed and left a cup on the table beside me. Every morning. For 12 days. He leaned back, his voice steady. On the 12th day, I said thank you. That was the first word I'd spoken since the accident. She looked at me and said, Pain isn't a curse, Mr. Valesco. It's a passage. Don't build a mansion inside it. Then she went back to stitching. I swallowed. Why didn't you tell me any of this? Because I didn't want your love, he said plainly. I wanted to repay a debt, and I didn't want to use your grief for my redemption. We sat in silence, but it wasn't a silence that hurt. It was a silence that held. I stared at him. Really stared. I had spent weeks thinking of Dominic as cold, calculated, but sitting across from me now was not a man made of stone. He was a man who had once been broken, then stitched back together by a woman with a cinnamon thermos and a gentle song, and now he had tried to do the same for her daughter. I rose from my chair and crossed the room. I didn't touch him, but I sat beside him, shoulder to shoulder. And for the first time, we watched the fire together. Not as strangers bound by paper, but as people beginning to understand what presence really meant. The days, after the funeral passed like smoke through an open window, thin, shapeless, and impossible to catch. I returned to the estate because I had nowhere else to go. Not because Dominic asked, not because of obligation, but because the silence of that place didn't feel so harsh anymore. It felt shared. There's something about grief that slows time. You start to notice things you never did before. The way light hits a window at 6:17 a.m. The way your breath fogs in a kitchen that's still asleep. The way footsteps sound when they're the only thing moving in the house. That morning, I woke up before the sun. I didn't mean to. It just happened. Pulled a cardigan over my nightgown and padded barefoot down to the kitchen. The air was cold, the floor colder, but the act of walking, of doing something, was grounding. Familiar. I boiled water, added a cinnamon stick, and watched the steam rise like memory. It was the only routine I had left from before. A small rebellion against everything that had changed. I was stirring quietly when I heard the floorboard creak behind me. I didn't turn. I didn't have to. Couldn't sleep? Dominic's voice was soft, still hoarse with sleep. I shook my head and poured a second cup without asking. He walked past me and leaned on the counter opposite the stove, folding his arms. He wasn't in a suit, just a soft gray sweater and worn slacks, barefoot like me. It made him look less like a statue and more like a man trying not to crack. He took the mug when I handed it to him, and for a moment, we stood there, just two people in an old kitchen, cradling warmth between our palms. He took a sip and smiled, barely. "Still cinnamon," he murmured. "Just like her." I nodded, not trusting my voice. He didn't speak again. He didn't need to. Sometimes presence speaks louder than comfort. We sat at the small kitchen table, the one tucked near the window with a view of the garden's bare branches. Neither of us said a word for 10 minutes. But something shifted, not in the room. In me. There was a quiet magnetism to the way he held his cup, like he was steadying himself from the inside. I watched him, really watched him, not as the man who married me out of debt or the man who saved my mother, but as someone who had been alone for a very long time. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe it was the steam rising between us. Maybe it was the ache in my chest that no longer felt like loss, but like space that wanted to be filled with something human. I reached across the table and placed my hand on his. He froze. Not in fear, not in rejection, just surprise. His eyes met mine. There was no fire in them, no calculation, just warmth, dulled by time, but not extinguished. "I'm still here," I whispered, not even sure what I meant by it. He didn't answer with words. He turned his hand over, palm up, and laced his fingers through mine. We sat that way, hands joined, mugs cooling, outside light growing inch by inch. The room didn't change. The house didn't shift. But I did. For the first time, I wasn't surviving inside the walls of the Valesco estate. I was choosing to be here, to reach out, to stay. Later that morning, I returned to the sewing room at the back of the house. It had been unused for years, but I found a box of my mother's things, her measuring tape, her thimble, even the small pincushion shaped like a tomato I'd always loved as a child. I brought them upstairs and arranged them by the window. Dominic found me there in the afternoon. "You're sewing again?" he asked gently. I nodded. I think she would have wanted that. He stepped closer, hesitating. "I want to give you space, Elena, but I also want you to know I'm here, not as an obligation, not anymore." I turned to face him. The sunlight caught the gold flecks in his eyes, and for once they looked tired. Human. Honest. "I know," I said. "That's why I'm still here too." We didn't touch. Not this time. But there was something in the stillness between us that felt closer than contact. It was no longer about owing, or rescuing, or repaying. It was becoming something else, entirely. That night I wrote in my journal, a habit I'd lost since the wedding. I wrote, "Today I touched his hand and didn't pull away, not because I had to, not because I wanted to understand him, but because for the first time, I felt understood. I didn't know what would happen next. But as the wind brushed softly against the window panes and the scent of cinnamon lingered in the folds of my sweater, I felt the first stirrings of something like peace. The box smelled like her. That faint blend of cedar, lavender, and old thread. The scent that had always clung to her sweater sleeves and the folds of her apron. It was tucked away in a forgotten corner of the upstairs linen closet, beneath a stack of unused quilts. I found it on a morning too bright for grieving, when my fingers needed to touch something real. It wasn't a fancy box. Just smooth cedar wood, hand-sanded, with brass hinges slightly tarnished, and a name etched faintly on the bottom. Margaret. Grace. My mother's name. Inside I found buttons, hundreds of them, sorted by color and sewn onto tiny scraps of fabric. Her old glasses case, a rosary, a handkerchief embroidered with my initials, and wrapped in tissue paper, a sealed envelope addressed in her hand, to the man who loved my daughter in silence. My breath caught. I stood there, barefoot on the wooden floor, heart pounding like I'd stumbled upon something sacred. I hesitated. For a moment, I wondered if the letter was meant for Dominic, or someone else. But I knew. I had always known. I sat down at the foot of my bed, carefully unsealing the envelope. The paper crackled, soft, yellowed, warm from memory. Her handwriting was steadier than in the later years. This had been written with full clarity. Intention. You may never read this, or you may only read it when you believe you failed her. If so, let me say this first. You haven't, Dominic. Thank you for loving my girl the way you loved your grief. Quietly, without display, but with depth, I could feel even when you said nothing. You have always carried love like a secret. But secrets weigh, don't they? If she's with you now, if she's reading this beside you, please do not wait another year to tell her what you feel. She is her mother's daughter, strong, loyal, and too quick to give herself away without asking. What she deserves in return, give her honesty and warmth, and the space to choose you freely, not as payment, not as gratitude, but as a woman ready to belong. You owe me nothing, but you owe her that. Margaret Grace. I folded the letter back with trembling fingers, tears sliding down without warning. It wasn't just a blessing. It was a charge, a mother's final ask. And suddenly I realized something I hadn't been brave enough to face before. I had been falling for him, not the man in suits, not the rescuer of debts, but the man who sat with his grief like it was furniture, who drank tea without sugar because that's how my mother made it, who touched my hand like it meant more than any vow. He hadn't spoken his feelings, but she had seen them, long before I did. That evening, I waited for him, not in the kitchen, or the sewing room, or the firelit library. I waited by the garden window in the east hallway, the one my mother once said had the most honest light. Dominic appeared just before sunset, coat in hand, ready to leave for a meeting, his jaw set as always. But when he saw me, he paused. "Found something today," I said, voice steady. He raised an eyebrow. "A letter, from her, for you." His face didn't change, but he didn't look away either. I handed him the envelope, now resealed, and nodded. "You should read it alone." "But I wanted you to know." She knew. He took the letter with careful fingers, as if it might dissolve. She said, "You carry love like a secret," I added, watching him closely. A long silence passed between us. Finally, he spoke. "She knew me better than I ever deserved," I smiled gently. "She knew you exactly enough." He looked at me, and for the first time, his eyes softened. Not in sorrow, not in restraint, but in something close to openness. "I'll read it," he said quietly. "Thank you." Then he did something he hadn't done since our wedding. He touched my cheek. Just a thumb, brushing lightly beneath my eye. Not because I was crying, but because he wanted to know what my skin felt like when it wasn't guarded. That night, I sat by the fireplace and reread my own journal. I traced over the lines I had written days earlier, about touch and understanding, and then I turned to a new page. She knew before I did. She saw something forming in the quiet spaces between us. And now, I think I do too. I am not surviving him anymore. I am beginning to choose him. Outside, the moon was full and steady, casting a silver sheen over the snow-covered hill. The estate didn't feel like a cage anymore. It felt like a place something new might grow. Something patient and real. And, just maybe, something lasting. The orchard behind the estate hadn't bloomed in years. The apple trees still stood, bare and patient, branches like veins reaching for something just beyond the horizon. The snow had melted in patches, revealing the hard ground beneath, dark, damp, waiting for spring. Dominic met me there, as promised. He wasn't wearing a coat, just a navy sweater and gloves, and somehow the cold didn't seem to touch him. We walked in silence for a while, boots crunching softly on the frost-bitten path. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the slope. Orange light caught in the spaces between branches, stretching the trees like ghosts into the snow. He was the one who spoke first. I planted these trees the year after Clara died. I stopped walking. Clara, his wife. The name he never spoke. He kept his eyes ahead, voice low and even. We'd bought the estate together just 6 months before the accident. She wanted an orchard. She said it would remind her of her childhood in Maine. I thought it was impractical. I said trees take too long to grow. A faint smile tugged at his mouth. She said that's what made them worth planting. We kept walking. My chest felt tight, not from jealousy, but from something more complicated. Reverence, maybe. The sense of touching a memory not your own. She died in a car accident, he continued. Coming home from the market. It was raining. A truck ran a red light. It was instant. I didn't interrupt, just listened. She was the light of every room, he said, and when she left, the house went dark. He paused. I left the orchard alone after that. Never touched it again. A wind moved between us. I tucked my hands into my coat, heart aching not just for him, but for the version of him that had once loved without fear. She was a good woman, I said gently. He nodded. But I didn't know how to grieve her. Not properly. I turned silent. Hard. I stopped living in rooms that had memories in them. And that's when your mother showed up. We had reached the edge of the trees now. The light was gold, spilling across his face like a benediction. For the first time, he looked younger, not in age, but in spirit, like someone beginning to shed an old skin. She didn't ask questions, he said. She didn't try to fix me. She just showed up every morning and made tea, cinnamon and honey, left it by the chair. I know, I whispered. She wrote about it. She remembered everything. His eyes shifted to mine. Something flickered. There. Something raw and open. I never forgot her voice, he said. When she finally spoke to me, it wasn't pity. It was permission. She gave me the right to feel what I was too proud to admit. We stood there for a moment, wrapped in silence and wind and memory. Then he turned to me. When I offered marriage, he said, I told myself it was debt, repayment, protection. His voice grew quieter. But that wasn't the truth. Not even then. I swallowed hard. Then why didn't you say anything? Because I didn't want you to feel owned, he said, and I didn't trust myself not to fall into old habits. Power, control, silence. He stepped closer now, his breath visible between us. It started because of her, he said. He reached out and took my hand, firmly, without hesitation. But today, it's because of you. My chest tightened, not in pain, in release. Something unspoken broke open inside me. Something that had been waiting since the day I walked down the aisle to a stranger. I held his hand tighter. I don't need a reason anymore, I said softly. I just need a place to begin. He nodded, and we stood there, beneath the bare orchard, as the last light of the day melted over the hills, our shadows touching before our lips ever would. Later, that night, I sat at my sewing table, staring at the spool of thread in my hand. The last time I used it, I had been making a veil I never truly believed I'd wear. Now, I threaded the needle slowly, steadily, not to finish something, but to begin. He left the papers on the windowsill. I found them just after breakfast. No note, no explanation, just a cream-colored envelope with my name written in his familiar, precise hand. Inside were 2 documents. An annulment agreement unsigned, and a letter stating the original marriage contract was dissolved effective immediately. I sat in the garden room, the light soft across the tiled floor, holding that envelope like it might catch fire. No obligation. No contract. No more owed debts. Just me. And the choice that now belonged entirely to me. I didn't look for him until evening. All day, I moved through the house as if it were breathing differently. Lighter. Looser. As though something heavy had finally unclenched. The past few weeks had shifted more than just feelings. They'd rearranged my memory of him. Dominic was no longer the man at the end of a transaction. He was the man who brewed cinnamon tea, who stood silent beside a grave, who listened more than he spoke, who let go before he ever demanded. And now he had let go of me, not to lose me, but to offer me space to stay, if I wanted. I found him at dusk, outside by the orchard again, dressed in a navy coat, collar turned up against the wind. He was trimming dead branches, piling them neatly beside the fence. His sleeves were pushed up, revealing strong forearms dusted with bark. He didn't hear me approach, or maybe he did and said nothing. I stood beside him, watching the last light drift behind the trees. "I got your envelope," I said. He nodded, but didn't look up. "I thought you might want the choice." "I do." Another branch snapped beneath his blade. He moved carefully, like someone undoing a knot. "But I'm not signing it," I added. That made him pause. Slowly, he turned toward me, the setting sun touching the side of his face like a brushstroke. "You're sure?" I smiled, not with drama, but with quiet certainty. I was waiting to feel free so I could choose. And now I have. I choose this. I choose you. Not because I owe anything. Because I want to start again. His shoulders lowered. Not in relief, but in reverence. We didn't embrace, not yet. Instead, he bent down, picked up a small branch, and held it out to me like an offering. "Then let's plant something," he said. That night, we hosted our own ceremony. No guests, no music. Just the two of us, and a pot of cinnamon tea, on a tray. He brought out a small bouquet of wildflowers he'd gathered from the edge of the estate. I wore a soft cream dress I had sewn myself weeks earlier, with tiny embroidered leaves around the sleeves. He wore no tie. We stood in the middle of the orchard, the moon rising behind us, and said nothing rehearsed. I poured the tea into 2 chipped cups and handed him one. "To beginnings," I said. He clinked his cup to mine. "To choices freely made." We sat on the bench under the old pear tree, the same bench that had once sat unused for years. Now it held the weight of 2 people choosing to stay, without force, without fear. Dominic reached into his coat and pulled out something small. It was a ring. Simple. Silver. No stone. "It was my grandmother's," he said. "She gave it to my mother. My mother kept it in a box she never opened after my father died." He looked at me, no theatrics in his voice. "I don't want to give you something new. I want to give you something real. Something old. Something that's lasted." He slipped the ring onto my finger. No ceremony. Just intention. I touched it gently, feeling the faint ridge of time worn smooth along the band. "I didn't bring you anything," I said. He smiled. "You brought yourself. That's more than enough." Later, we returned to the house hand in hand. The hallway was dim, the sconces flickering low. I stopped by the cedar box, still open on the dresser, my mother's thimble catching the light. Turned to him. "She would have liked tonight," he nodded. "She would have asked for a second cup of tea." We laughed, softly, together. And it wasn't grief anymore. It was memory. Alive. Shared. That night I didn't write in my journal. I didn't need to. Some moments are too whole to be captured. They ask only to be lived. I didn't light the Fire that night. The room was already warm from the afternoon sun, and I didn't want anything burning except what was about to happen between us. The bed was turned down. The lamps were dim. The window cracked slightly to let in the scent of pine from the hills. He knocked once, but I'd already left the door open. Dominic stepped inside without speaking. He was in a black t-shirt and linen, pants, his hair slightly damp from a shower, and for once he looked uncertain, not guarded, not cold, just human. I stood by the window in a simple cotton nightgown. No silk, no lace, no pretense. I wanted him to see me the way I was, and I think he did. His eyes moved over me slowly, not as a man claiming something, but as one approaching something sacred. "Are you sure?" he asked. I nodded once. Yes. Not because of a contract. Not because we're supposed to. Just because I want to. He came closer. Not rushed, not hesitant. His hand brushed mine, and when I didn't move away, he took it fully. We stood there for a moment, hand in hand. Quiet. Present. Then I led him to the bed. He kissed my shoulder first. Not my lips. My shoulder. Bare, where the gown had slipped slightly down. His mouth was warm. Careful. Then his hands found my waist, both of them, and held me still as he pressed his face gently into my neck, just breathing me in. I slid my hands under his shirt and lifted it. He let me. I touched his skin. Warm, solid, real, and felt the breath he drew when my palms skimmed his ribs. He took my gown off next. Slowly. Not like peeling something away, but like unfolding it. Like unwrapping something that wasn't fragile but worthy of care. We were naked, but we didn't rush. He kissed my collarbone, then the center of my chest, then the soft skin just beneath. His hands followed, tracing down my sides, learning. Me by feel. I gasped once and he paused. "Okay?" he asked. "Yes," I whispered. "More." He kissed down my stomach, then back up, hands spreading across my hips. I pulled him up to me, face to face. Then I touched him, fully. No mystery. Now, no shame. He groaned softly, forehead resting against mine. We climbed into bed together, sheets cool against our skin. He settled between my legs and waited, holding himself above me, his gaze locked to mine. "Still sure?" he asked again. "Yes," I said. "I want this." And then he entered me, slowly, carefully, fully. I gasped again, not from pain, but from the fullness of it, the realness. His hands gripped mine, fingers interlaced above my head on the pillow. He moved slowly, deep, even. I matched him, body rising to meet his. We said nothing, just breathed, moved, became. He looked down at me, not with hunger, but with something quieter, something reverent. And then, as he pushed one final time, deeper than before, he exhaled and came inside me. I felt the warmth spread through me. I held his body tighter. He didn't pull away. He stayed in me, his weight settling carefully against mine, his mouth on my cheek, one hand still holding mine tightly as if afraid I'd drift away. We lay there, our bodies joined. The air between, us calm and quiet, no urgency, no demand, just two people who had finally arrived. Later, when he rolled to his side and pulled me close, I rested my head on his chest and listened to his heartbeat. It was steady, real, like his hand on my hip, like his breath on my temple. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Then I whispered, "Thank you." He answered, "For what?" "For not rushing, for not pretending, for letting this be real." He kissed the top of my head. "It's the only way I want it." We fell asleep like that. No promises, no vows, Just skin, breath, warmth, and the quiet comfort of knowing we had nothing to prove, only something to share. Ourselves. 1 year later. The house breathes differently. Now. There's a warmth in the hallways that didn't used to be there, like something has settled, quietly and firmly, into place. The orchard has started blooming again. Dominic replanted 2 trees last spring. We don't know if they'll bear fruit, but we walk through the rows most mornings, hand in hand, watching the branches fill with life. This morning, I sat at the kitchen table while the kettle boiled, a cinnamon stick already waiting in the mug. I felt her move, just a flutter, like a page turning inside me, and I thought, she'll want to know how this all began. So I wrote her a letter. Not because I expect to explain everything, but because someday she might ask. And when she does, I want her to know the truth. Not the polished version, but the real one. To my daughter, you will grow up in a house that feels warm, that smells like tea and pine and old books. You'll walk barefoot on wood floors and ask why we keep 3 chairs in the garden when there are only 2 of us. One of them is for your grandmother. She never met you. But she saved your family before you were ever born. She taught your father how to grieve. And she taught me how to stay soft, even when the world felt sharp. I married your father before I ever loved him. I married him to save my family. And then, slowly without realizing it, I began to save myself. From fear, from silence, from the idea that love has to arrive with fireworks. Sometimes love shows up quietly. Sometimes it makes tea. Sometimes it waits. Your father waited. He let go of me before I asked him to. And in that space, I chose to stay. I hope one day when love comes to you, it feels like peace. Not a storm to survive, but a place to rest. Hope you never confuse noise with depth, and if you do, come sit with me in the kitchen. I'll make you tea, we'll talk, or we won't. Either way, you'll be loved, always. Your mother, Elena. I folded the letter, slid it into an envelope, and placed it gently in the cedar box, beside my mother's thimble, and the ring that once belonged to Dominic's grandmother. It didn't feel like closure, it felt like continuation. Dominic came in a few minutes later, brushing snow off his coat. He saw me standing at the box and paused, a quiet question in his eyes. "A letter," I said. He smiled. "For her?" I nodded. "For when she's ready?" He came over, kissed my forehead, and pulled me into his chest, the same way he always does when words feel too small. We stood there a while. His hand rested over my growing belly. The room smelled like cinnamon and something sweet baking in the oven. Outside, the trees were dusted white again. Inside, we were steady. Later that afternoon, we sat by the fireplace, watching the flames dance. The windows fogged gently with the weight of warmth meeting cold. Dominic reached for my hand, as he often does without thinking. I squeezed it and laid my head on his shoulder. "Did you ever imagine this?" I asked. He took a breath. "Not like this. Not with so much stillness." "Is that a good thing?" "It's the best thing," he said. "Because it's real." We didn't say more. We didn't have to. That night, as we got ready for bed, I looked out across the orchard one last time. A full moon cast long shadows across the snow, and for a moment, I could almost see her there, my mother, standing beneath the pear tree, arms crossed, smiling just a little. I whispered a thank you, not just for Dominic, not just for the life I had now, but for the silence she taught me to trust, for the way she loved me without noise, for the courage she gave me to begin again, when all I had was a name, a dress, and a broken version of myself. As I slipped into bed beside the man I now loved without hesitation, I rested one hand on my stomach and one against his chest. His breathing slowed. Mine followed. And together, we drifted, not into sleep, but into something softer, something lasting. If this story touched something in your heart, even just a moment of quiet, a familiar image, or a feeling you didn't quite expect, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Every subscription helps us keep telling gentle, heartfelt stories, just for you. Thank you for staying until the very last word.